On the heels of the 2016 presidential election, where Donald J. Trump was elected to be the 45th president of the United States by winning the Electoral College map, but not winning a majority of the popular vote, needless to say, his beginning to his presidency was going to be critical, because he was not going to be somebody that enjoyed a massive mandate. He was not going to be somebody that enjoyed a huge groundswell of popularity. And needless to say, his first year in office, he hasn't really done himself any favors. It has been, at the very least, a rocky and tumultuous and borderline disastrous start to a presidency, and that is reflected in his historically bad approval ratings at this point of his presidency compared to his predecessors like Obama and Bush 43 and Clinton and Bush 41 and Reagan. I mean, he's in a bad place. He's in the mid to high 30s in terms of approval rating. There really hasn't been a honeymoon period for him as a new president. But that hasn't necessarily carried over to statewide special election races, whether it be Georgia or Kansas or Montana. Republicans have been able to hold serve, even with there apparently being a groundswell of anti-Trump sentiment and anti-Trump feelings. So I'm not surprised that there was going to be a lot of attention placed on November 7th, 2017, and this year's election cycle. It's an off year, so there were going to be concerns about turnout, and was this going to be a time where we saw that internet anger was only internet anger and didn't lead to actual turnout that mattered at the polling places? Or were people going to be motivated, and was turnout going to be higher than it typically is on an off-year election? That was the big question. And I think we ultimately kind of got our answer. No matter how you want to spin it or no matter how you want to look at it, it was a successful night for the Democrats. It was a pretty big night for the Democrats. Just how big, just how earth-shattering could depend on your perspective. But it was definitely a big win for the Democrats. They needed to come out swinging. They needed to be successful. They needed victories at this point in time, because they've been a party that's really slumping. You know, even during Obama's time in the office of president, while he was winning his elections down ballot at the Senate level, the House of Representatives level, governor level, mayors, city council members, all of that, there had been a wide sweeping movement towards the Republicans, towards the GOP during the 8 years under Obama. Nobody can dispute that. You look at the governor map, just the governor map of the 50 states, from the time Obama took office to the time he left office. It tells you all you need to know. So the Democrats needed some momentum. They needed something positive. And at least, if nothing else for them, this was a positive. It was a night full of historic firsts, where Democrats could pat themselves on the back and pretend to be so awesome. You look at Virginia, the state I'm in now. Danica Ram is the first openly transgender state delegate in U.S. history. Justin Fairfax became the second black man to ever hold statewide office. I believe Douglas Wilder was the first. Kathy Tran, the first Asian American state delegate in Virginia. Ayala, and Elizabeth Guzman, the first Hispanic state delegates in Virginia history. And then you go other places. You had Sheila Oliver became the first black lieutenant governor in New Jersey's history. Ravinder Bala, he's a Sikh, and he's now the mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey. V. Lyles became the first black female mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. Melvin Carter, the first black mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota. Andrea Jenkins, the first black transgender woman to win public office in any place in the United States. Wilmot Collins, a former immigrant, I believe, is now the mayor, black man, of Helena, Montana, of all places. Joyce Craig, the first female mayor of Manchester, New Hampshire. Jenny Durkin, the first openly lesbian mayor of Seattle, Washington, the first openly gay mayor of Seattle, Washington, the first female mayor that city has had since the 1920s. Mazahir Salih, he's somebody of Sudanese descent. He was elected to the Iowa City City Council. Tyler James Titus, a transgender man elected to the Erie School Board in Erie, Pennsylvania. So it was a night where Democrats, progressives, liberals could feel good about themselves and look at this country and say that we can be better and that we can be more inclusive and that they could be the party that owned most of that. So you could understand why Democrats feel good. After years of outside of Obama really struggling and scuffling and frankly getting their teeth kicked in by the Republicans, by the GOP, up to and including that embarrassing loss in the 2016 presidential election, and looking at the national picture and seeing a presidency, both houses of Congress that are all GOP controlled, a Supreme Court that could even more be shaped by the GOP in years to come, the Democrats really needed that night this past Tuesday, and they got it. And a lot of people are going to look ahead based off of the results here and read a lot of things into it and automatically jump to the conclusion, using Virginia as kind of that logic point, to say that there are bigger things on the horizons for the Democrats, specifically next year in 2018, when you get to the midterm elections and all these Senate races are up for grabs, all these House of Representative races are up for grabs, some more governor's races are going to be up for grabs, that night, a year from now, could be big for the Democrats as well. And they're going to use that Virginia example of Bill Clinton when he won the presidency in 92. The next year, George Allen was elected governor of Virginia, Republican. And in 94, the GOP swept into power with the Contract for America behind Newt Gingrich's leadership. And they took control of both houses of Congress for the first time in decades. In decades. They took control of Congress for the first time in decades, in large part due to Clinton's unpopularity early on in his presidency. 2004, Bush got reelected. It was a big win for the Republicans. But in 2005 here in Virginia, Tim Kaine, a Democrat, succeeded Mark Warner, the previous Democratic governor of Virginia. Another Democratic governor was elected in Virginia. And then in 2006, the Democrats, based off of a lot of anti-war sentiment and Bush fatigue, swept into power and took back control of both houses of Congress in a big, big way. Then you look at 2008, Barack Obama, historic election, first African-American, first black man, first biracial man, however you want to classify him as. He was a first, period, to be president of the United States, to come from a multiracial background, whatever. But the point is, it was a historic election, but come next year, it was McConnell who won the Virginia governor's race. And then in 2010, the GOP swept back into power based off of a lot of anti-Obama, anti-Obamacare sentiment. So now I understand where a lot of the politico types are looking at it and saying, well, Trump won in 2016. Now you've had an opposite party governor elected in Northam in 2017. Based off of the history in Virginia, at least, that's an indication of big things to come, and potentially a landscape-changing political wave is going to hit in the midterms in 2018, especially with healthcare having been the predominant issue in 2017, similar to how it was for Obama and the Democrats for 2009 and 2010, and it didn't go very well for them. And over the years, it really didn't go very well for them. That now, with the tables turned and the GOP now having to be for something instead of just being against something, now that they've put their ideas out there, people realize just how terrible they are, and believe me, they are, that automatically means that 2018 is going to be this groundswell and this big, big, huge, massive night for the Democrats. And my caution is this: don't count your chickens before they hatch. Don't get too far ahead of the game, and don't read too much into what happened in 2017 and automatically assume that that will translate to 2018 or even going even more into the future, 2020. Because first of all, healthcare was the top issue that drove this. It might not be by the time we get to 2018. It could be the GOP's handling of tax reform. It could be Trump himself and his handling of foreign affairs. It could be Russia scandals. It could be this. It could be any number of things. Some of them that could be more beneficial, obviously, to the Democrats than others. While healthcare was the big issue this time, the fact is the GOP got nothing done. And at some point in time, you can't just run on the fear of what might happen. You have to actually run for something and against something that actually has happened, not just the threat or promise of it happening. So there's no guarantee healthcare is going to be that top driving issue like it was across the board, specifically here in Virginia in 2017. The Dems, keep in mind, had big losses in 93 and 94, as I referenced a little bit with the Virginia example. Bill Clinton was still reelected by a pretty wide margin in 96. Keep that in mind. The Democrats also had big losses 2009 through 2011, frankly, in local and statewide races. Obama was still reelected in 2012 by a pretty healthy margin. He only lost a couple of states that he had previously won before. I mean, so let's not look at it and automatically say that these victories here in 2017 automatically translate to Trump being a one-term president, because based off of historical precedents, there's no guarantee that that's the case. Defeating an incumbent president is incredibly difficult. Ask the Republicans in 2012. Ask the Democrats in 2004. Ask the Republicans in 96. Not an easy place to be. It just isn't. And don't read too much just into what happened in Virginia, because more and more Virginia is about non-Virginians that have moved here to Virginia, specifically people like me. Originally from the Midwest. I'm an Illinois guy, went to Iowa, and now I'm here. There's a lot of other people like me, especially in the northern suburbs. Now, I'm here in Richmond, which is a very, very blue area of the state anyways, but you're talking about the changing dynamics and demographics of the state. Like, Gillespie could win, huge margins in the south and southwest of the state, but it doesn't measure up when you can't perform well in Richmond or in the northern suburbs in places like Fairfax and Loudoun County. It just doesn't matter. And furthermore, Virginia has been trending blue for about a decade now. They've elected Democratic governors here before. They've had Democratic senators, Democratic House members. Furthermore, this is a state that broke for Obama twice, and even as bad of a candidate as Hillary Clinton was, this state still voted for her by about a 5% margin in 2016. So if Hillary Clinton could win this state by 5% in a presidential race, imagine if a slightly better candidate runs, how much they could potentially win the state by. So let's not pretend that even with the debates about Confederate monuments and this and that, and some of the backwoods thinking of some of the people here in Virginia when it comes to the NRA and so on and so forth, the simple fact of the matter is this state has been trending a specific way for over a decade now. The victories by Northam and the Democrats in this state look more impressive than really they actually factually are. There are historical precedents there in terms of the number of state delegate seats won by the Democrats. I think it's the biggest movement, Democrats, since like the late 1890s. So there's historical things at play here. But looking at the modern reality, it's not that surprising in the grand scheme of things. Then you look at New Jersey, the governor's race. I mean, Chris Christie has an approval rating of like 15%. The Democrats ran a former Goldman Sachs guy in Phil Murphy. That should have been a 30 to 40 point win, and he only won by like 15 percentage points. That's no great indictment on Trump. That's a blue state that goes blue in a big way for a president and has for a significant period of time. That traditionally goes blue with a lot of their Senate candidates, with a lot of their House representatives. So let's not pretend that Phil Murphy's victory was all that shocking or all that surprising. That had more to do with Chris Christie and how much he sucked and how much people hated that fucking walrus than it did necessarily Donald Trump and the nationwide Republicans. And then you look at the local races. Local races are different, and they have entirely different dynamics. Looking at Danica Rahm, all the focus on her being the first openly transgender person to ever be elected state delegate here in Virginia or be a state representative in any state of the union. But the simple fact of the matter is, when you get past that, the reason she won and her opponent lost, while it is very appropriate that her opponent was an author of the Virginia bathroom bill, was he was focused on cultural issues and things that his local constituents really didn't care that much about. And after 2.5 decades of being in power, people got a little fatigued of him. They got tired of him. And Danica Rahm focused on traffic. She focused on roads. She focused on local issues that mattered to her local constituents. That's why she was elected, period. She had a better message. She was a better candidate. She ran a better campaign. Transgender or not didn't matter. Pink or purple doesn't matter. The fact is she had better fundamentals in her messaging and her campaign than the incumbent did, and the incumbent got his teeth kicked down his throat as he should have and as he deserved. But again, these are local races with local impacts. They do not necessarily always match the reality of statewide and national politics. And furthermore, will that moderate and Democratic independent, all of their anger, carry over still to 2018 and 2020? That's a long time to be angry. That's a long time to stay at nuclear level. That's a long time to stay hot and bothered. That's a long time to stay motivated and inspired to go out and do something about it. While some of the turnout numbers here, especially in Virginia, were very encouraging, and not even for me as somebody who is not a fan of Donald Trump, just in terms of engagement of the process and seeing people get out and vote, it's comforting to me to see that people aren't taking it for granted regardless of how they vote. I don't care how people vote. I just want them to vote. And it was good to see a higher level of engagement, specifically here in Virginia. But will that translate over to the midterms? Will that translate over in 2018? Will that translate over to the presidential election in 2020? And again, talking about these states, when you look at all the other historical precedents, talk about Virginia, talk about New Jersey, North Carolina, Minnesota, Montana, New Hampshire, Iowa, Pennsylvania, these are all states with a history of voting for Democrats for statewide and for national offices. And even when you look at, a state, let's say, like a Montana, you think of them as this or that, but they've had Democratic governors, they've had Democratic senators, Democratic guys in the House of Representatives. Iowa, same thing. This is the state that really launched Barack Obama in 2008. Never forget that. New Hampshire is a very independent streak. Pennsylvania had been reliably Democrat for decades until Hillary Clinton ran a terrible campaign and was a terrible candidate. Minnesota, same deal. North Carolina, trending into purple territory, trending into, at least, if anything else, being a true toss-up battleground in national races and statewide races. New Jersey, historically Democrat. Virginia, trending blue for over a decade. So you're going to hear a lot, and will continue to hear a lot, about how big of a deal this was. But the fact is, it's not that big of a deal. If these type of things were happening in places like Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia and Kansas and Oklahoma, and states where Democrats traditionally don't do well, I think of Arizona as another example, if the Democrats were enjoying big victories there against the GOP, then that really speaks to a fundamental problem for Trump and the GOP. But all the Democrats are doing, as much as anything else, is gaining back some of their previous momentum, and in some cases taking back their rightful place of where they had been in previous years and previous decades. That's not necessarily a guarantee of a groundswell of this or that or anything else. It just happens to be a reflection of those individual local municipalities, those local areas, statewide areas, where Democrats, moderates, and independents were more motivated this time for races that matter to them on a local and statewide level, not necessarily a national level. And when you look at people like Danica Roem, when you look at some of the other people that did win, it still comes down to having the right candidate with the right message across the spectrum to beat the GOP and Trump in 2018 and 2020. Because I can assure you, Ed Gillespie was not a heavily liked guy here in 2017, especially when he started going off into the culture war aspects of the campaign, and he really tinged it with some racial components. Virginians were going to resent that, especially in the big city like Richmond, down in the Virginia Beach and Norfolk area, going up into the northern suburbs. It's not surprising that where he had performed relatively well in 2014 when he almost upset Mark Warner in the Senate race, he didn't do as well this time. But the fact is, Ralph Northam ran a bad campaign and really got off message and really went off the track late. And I know for me, as somebody who voted for Northam in this election, I did not vote for Northam because of Ralph Northam. I voted for Ralph Northam to vote against Ed Gillespie because I was afraid that Ed Gillespie might win. And Ed Gillespie represented so much of what I think is wrong about the American political system. I was not enthralled by Ralph Northam. I was not excited by Ralph Northam. And I can guarantee you that if there would have been a better candidate somewhere else, I might have voted for them, whether that be GOP, whether that be Libertarian or Independent or somewhere else. I was not excited about Ralph Northam. I was excited about the thought of helping to stop Ed Gillespie. And again, it gets to a bigger problem for the Democrats in general. At what point in time do you stop being against something like the GOP was for so many years, and they still kind of are? They're more against things than they are really for things and making things actually happen. You have to start being for things on top of just being against and kind of being obstructionist. And you must get to a point where you find candidates that can excite people. You must find candidates that motivate people and inspire people. Ralph Northam did none of that for me. Me voting for him had very little, if anything, to do with him. It had to do with the opponent and being against something. But that's not necessarily going to motivate me to vote for a Democratic candidate or, on the flip side, a Republican candidate come 2018 or 2020. You must have the right candidates with the right message. And for some of these local races, that's the biggest lesson that the Democrats can learn, is talk about those things that matter to the constituents. Talk about those things that matter to the people that you represent. And sometimes that might take you away from the anti-Trump train. Sometimes it might hitch your caboose right up to it. It was a big night for the Democrats, as much as anything else, to stall the negative momentum they've had over the past 8+ years. It's kind of their stopping point. Now they've kind of shifted the momentum a little bit to where they can get a little more on the offensive, and now the GOP, being that incumbent party, being that party in power at so many different levels of government throughout our country, they're now going to have to hunker down. They're going to have to play defense. And that's not the position you always want to be in. When you're defensive, you're more reactionary than you are proactive. You want to be able to be proactive. You want to set the agenda. You want to set the narrative. You want to set the propaganda, whatever the case might be. But for those that are heartened by this, don't get lazy. Get involved, get motivated, and keep voting. And if you automatically think that the Democrats are going to sweep back into power in 2018, I've got news for you. A lot can change in a year. A lot. You have to make sure that you've got the right candidates with the right message. That's how you get the job done, especially going into 2020. If you don't, you're going to be very disappointed with those future results, because you'll be fooled into a false sense of security based off of what happened here in 2017.